I'm just putting in my microphone. There's nothing crazy going on here. Okay. Let's see. Well, good morning, everybody. Normally, I would let you continue talking until like 9:50 because I'm never on time for anything, and so I'm not going to force anybody else to be on time. But this morning, we got a lot to go through. So I'm hopeful that we're going to get through it all. We will see. Thankfully, this week, there's no lead-in from Seth talking about how this is going to be the best class ever. So maybe this will, in fact, be a decent class. We'll see. All right, so we'll get going. So last week, oh man, I forgot to animate the check mark there, so you just got a random check mark, my fault. So our 4-week agenda, last week we introduced kind of the topic that we're going to be talking about. We talked about God as the life giver, provider, sustainer, and we talked about how important it is to connect with each other. This week, we will talk about sin and shame. Next week, which is week 4, my numbers are bad. I'm also bad at math. Goodness. So anyway, the God of grace, we'll talk about that next week. We'll also finish shame because I don't think we're going to get through it all today. And even if we get through everything I have prepared today, there's still more to talk about next week. So we'll finish it up next week. We'll give some strategies on how to deal with it. And all those will coincide with God being graceful. All right, so week 1, talked about creation. We found out everything was really good. Then all of a sudden it wasn't good. And then all of a sudden it was very good. And that was kind of the progression of creation, if you remember. God was meant to be the creator, giver, and sustainer of life. Now, when we say creator, we don't mean God just took a bunch of random things and put them together and made something. What we mean is God took absolutely nothing and created everything. So from nothing came something. When we think of creativity here, we always think of, oh, I'm creative because I can take ingredients A, B, C, and D and get output whatever. Well, God did that. Except he didn't have ingredients A, B, C, and D. He had nothing. And he created something. So that's what we mean by the creator, giver of life. Obviously, we talked about the Spirit of God being inside of us. He breathed it into us. And the sustainer of life, he gives us strength to continue to go. We just talked about that. And then we talked about the importance of connection. So how important it is that, looking in the garden where Adam was by himself, in relationship, direct relationship with God, Adam had before Eve was created. And even with that, God said, no, this isn't good. And so then he created Eve. And then he said, wait a minute, now this is very good. So connection is really, really important. All right, so sin and shame. Now, Seth, if you guys were in first service, Seth asked a question. He said, how many of you think the Bible is hard to understand? Raise your hand. I definitely raised my hand. And then I was thinking to myself, this is a topic that's really hard to understand. And fortunately, I get to teach about it. So raise your hand if you would like to come up and teach with me. About shame? No? Okay. I appreciate the laughter. I was really hoping for some hands, though. No big deal. All right, so before I get going, let's go ahead and turn to Genesis 2. We'll start the last verse of chapter 2, and we'll go through verse 11 of chapter 3. Does anybody want to read that real quick? Or maybe a better question is, would anybody read that real quick?
Adam and his wife were both naked and they felt no shame. Now the serpent was more crafty than any of the wild animals the Lord God had made. He said to the woman, did God really say you must not eat from any tree in the garden? The woman said to the serpent, we may eat fruit from the trees in the garden, but God did say you must not eat fruit from the tree that is in the middle of the garden. You must not touch it or you will die. You will certainly not die, the serpent said to the woman. For God knows that when you eat from it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil. When the woman saw that the fruit of the tree was good for food, and pleasing to the eye, and also desirable for gaining wisdom, she took some and ate it. She also gave some to her husband who was with her, and he ate it. Then the eyes of both of them were opened, and they realized they were naked. So they sewed fig leaves together and made coverings for themselves. Then the man and his wife heard the sound of the Lord God as he was walking in the garden in the cool of the day. and they hid from the Lord God among the trees of the garden. But the Lord God called to the man, "Where are you?" He answered, "I heard you in the garden, and I was afraid, because I was naked, so I hid." And he said, "Who told you that you were naked? Have you eaten from the tree that I commanded you not to eat from?" The man said, "The woman you put here with me, she gave me some from the fruit of the tree, and I ate it."
All right. Good job. All right. So we get the story of they're in the garden. They're with God. They have a relationship. There's no shame, right? And then all of a sudden, something changes just 11 verses later. So let's talk about what that is. Find out in verse 1 there, chapter 3, Satan enters the story, right? Satan, we don't know who that is prior. This is the first mention of him. So he comes in. He's described, and depending on the translation that you use, it's crafty, subtle, cunning. But the word cunning, the Hebrew there, the connotation is very negative. It's not cunning as in, look, oh, you're really smart. Let's talk about how to figure things out. No, it's cunning as in, hey, you're really smart. I need to be careful around you. That's the connotation here. The Hebrew root there is Alrum, I believe is how you pronounce it. I don't know. Jonathan Schwartz, is he in here? He could probably tell us better. I guess he's not. Okay. So what does this mean? This means Satan manipulates us intellectually in ways that we don't often notice or recognize. He's really, really good at this. This is his whole plan. This was his whole scheme to tempt all of mankind, right? It wasn't to come out and say, hey, look, God hates you. Let's move on from him. It's not what he said. He just came out and very subtly, very cunningly got us to agree with him in ways that God would not want us to agree with him. So deception being his main tool, yep, and he convinces us of things. And like I said, the best word I could think of to describe how Satan convinces us, what Satan convinces us of, are things that are just incomplete. That was the best way I could describe it. You know, we talk about how much truth is it before it's really true, right? Is it 5%? Is it 95%? The truth is it doesn't matter if it's not 100%, it's not fully true. Satan is really, really good at taking something that is mostly true and subtly not true, and not to where we don't understand the consequences that come from that, and getting us to believe those things. He's incredible at it, like incredible. And that's why it's so important that we have God on our side, because otherwise we won't notice these things. All right, then we move into verse 5 here of chapter 3. And this is where it all gets kind of interesting, because Satan asks a question, and then he makes a couple statements. And there are some implied answers here that we need to be very well aware of. So what's Satan's first question that he asks here? And it's on the screen for those of you that think this is a quiz. I'm not trying to be tricky here. There we go. He says, did God say you really couldn't eat from any tree in the garden? Is that what God said? Was God's plan to create humanity, provide all this food, and then starve them to death? No, that wasn't God's plan at all. His plan was to put us in the garden, give us everything that we needed and then some, and just set some simple ground rules. So what does Satan say next? Eve says, no, that's not the plan. Come on, we can eat from all these trees. We just can't eat from those or we'll die. And then what's Satan say? You won't die. He says, look, Eve, first off, God's not trying to starve you to death. I get that. Second, he didn't create you just so I could show up and ask you a couple questions and then he could kill you. That's not how this works.
You can't ignore the fact, though, that with what Eve said, she proved that Satan was already, what he was trying to do was already working. He said, no, he didn't say that. He said we can't eat from this tree and we can't, we can't touch it. And God never said that they couldn't touch it. So she was already buying into Satan's half-truths.
Yeah, well, again, he's really good at it, right? So he says, look, you're not going to die. You're not going to die. God is not going to starve you. God did not create you so that you could eat all this stuff, be full, and then he can murder you. That's not how this works. Come on, Eve, right? And so next, Eve says, okay, I understand. And then Satan's next statement is, God knows that if you eat it, you will be like the gods. And depending on the version that you read, that's interpreted a little bit differently. Some versions say you will be like God himself. Some versions say you'll be like the gods, meaning angels. Either way, what Satan is trying to convince Eve of is, look, God doesn't want you to eat from that tree, because as soon as you do, humanity as a whole gets an upgrade. Right? That's what he's telling her. You are created to be this. This is what God tells you. Here's what you could be. You could be different. And he puts it out there in terms of you could be better. You could be something that is above what you think you already are. It's pretty appealing, right? How many times has someone came to you and said, hey, I have this idea that can make you better, superior, different, you'll know it, you'll understand more, you'll have more, whatever it is, and we sit back and think, no, I just don't want that. How often does that happen? Never. Thank you. That's exactly the word I was thinking. Never, right? We're always intrigued. We're always interested. And we don't always follow through, but we're always intrigued. We're always interested. We always want something more than what we have. That's just the root of humanity. Okay. I don't know what's going on there. Anyway, so next one. What is Satan really asking Eve here as we go through all this? And sorry for the PowerPoint issues this morning. I need to write this all down in Word and then find someone that is actually technically competent and have them put together a PowerPoint for me. And I realize that for a couple of reasons. One, these slides are a mess. Number two, I actually hate these slides, and I didn't realize it last 2 weeks ago when I was putting this together. I thought, oh, these are awesome, because like we're talking about creation, and it shows like space and space. Yeah, we're talking about the garden. So anyway, what is Satan really asking Eve here? What is he really getting at with his question in 2 statements?
Really trust God to be acting in your best interest?
Yeah, can you really trust God to be acting in your best interest? I said it a little differently, but basically the same thing, right? Is God really who he says he is? That's what Satan is asking her. He's looking at Eve and he's saying, look, God is saying he is this. He is saying he's all these wonderful things. You're around him every day. He's putting off this air, this aura. But why is he restricting you from being better than you could be? Is he really who he says he is? And what's Eve's answer? No. Right? That's the implied answer here. And then what's the next thing that Satan is trying to get across? Well, if God isn't who he says he is, then guess what? You're not who he says you are.
With that, I think it's him questioning her. Do you really trust him? Do you believe him?
Mm-hmm.
Like, do you really believe him? And, it's kind of like that, and then it makes her look at herself and,
Yeah.
She has nothing to go on except for what someone's whispering in her ear.
No, absolutely. That's absolutely true. And that's kind of inherent here, right? And everything we're talking about is, do you really believe God is who he is? And that's a big question to answer. That's a question we struggle with every day, right? Every minute of every day. And that's why it's so important when we talked about a couple weeks ago that God is the sustainer of life, and not just the sustainer of our life in general, the sustainer of our life in specific, not just in direction, but in every day of our lives. God is the sustainer, right? Because otherwise it's so easy to get off track. Go ahead.
He knew everything that was going to happen and where we were headed. Did Satan also, did he know that, and that's why he was just, butting the heads and trying to create this havoc, or?
Does Satan know the future? No. There's nothing in Scripture that says Satan knows, and I shouldn't say the future, long-term future, no. There are some things that hint that he may know immediate steps. Yeah, but no, he just hates God, and therefore he hates us. So it's really as simple as that, I think. There's a lot of people that will give you a long-winded answer about that, and I'm also going to give you a long-winded answer, but what I just said is basically it, right? He hates God, so he hates us. That's where this all comes from. All right, so if God is not who he says he is, and you are not who you say, or you are not who he says you are, you could be more, what do? We eat the fruit. Because we want to be more. And so Eve does, right? She takes a bite of the fruit, and then she shares it with Adam. Adam eats it too. And I'm not going to dwell on the fact that he's standing right there by her this whole time. That is true. And I actually think the greater sin is not necessarily the eating of the fruit. I think the greater sin is Adam not doing his job and taking care of his wife and subduing the earth. I think that is the bigger deal here. But again, I'm not going to dwell on that. You guys can email me offline if you want to. Goodness gracious. Those slides I'm so sorry. So now, We get into verse 7, and what do we find out? We find out the effects of disobedience. So we've disobeyed. We've told God, yeah, you created us. Yes, you took nothing. You made something. One of those somethings was me. You breathed life into me. You gave me your spirit. But guess what? I know you're cheating me. I know there's more, is what Eve is saying, is what Adam is saying back to God. So what are the effects of this? Their eyes are opened, verse 7 says. What in the world does that mean? Does it mean they were blind before and all of a sudden now they can see things? No. What does it mean? What's that? They felt shame. That's a great word. We'll get into that here in just a minute.
What Jesus talks about in several sermons, he who has eyes to see and ears to hear, not just talking about vision right here, now they're able to see in a spiritual manner.
Mm-hmm.
And the spiritual manner is, I sinned.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, go ahead.
In Texas lingo, I thought maybe they knew they had been hornswoggled by the devil, that that wasn't really true.
Yeah. And I do think there's a lot of truth there.
So Satan promised they would know good from evil. Did they not know good from evil before?
No, not necessarily. And that's the other aspect here. You know, we get into this. Oh, go ahead, Justin, before I. No, please.
The journey of Adam and Eve is all of our journey.
Mm-hmm.
I think sometimes we lose sight when we talk about them in this kind of manner that it's like, well, they did this as though we haven't done the same.
Yeah.
They were the first, but we all do this. So I think the key question is, when were our eyes open?
Yeah.
When did we sin in such a way? At the moment, it sounded like a good idea, and then the realization comes of what has just happened. This is good and evil, and I have been evil, and here are the results of being evil. So anytime I'm seeing this journey of Adam and Eve, and we're like at a confusing point, what does this mean? The answer is, when did that happen to me?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, this is absolutely personal. It absolutely is. And I think that's something that often gets lost, right? I know growing up, thought, man, if I was in the garden, Eve, put her in her place real quick, right? We would still be there. But the truth is that's dumb. And I know that's dumb because I walk into certain places and I see things and I know they're wrong, and then what do? I do them. Even though I know I consciously know they're wrong before I do them, and I still do them. So no, we wouldn't have been better off if I was in the garden. We would have been in the same spot if any of us were in the garden. And I think that's a point well deserved. Go ahead, Jared.
To answer your question, exactly when you're saying their eyes were opened, that's what I think of. They did it, or I did it, and now I'm like, why did I do that?
Yeah.
Now my eyes are open because now I'm dealing with the repercussions of something I did that I shouldn't have.
Yep. Yeah, and we'll get into all this here in a little more detail in just a second. So, to understand what he means, which I think we already all do, let's go back to chapter 2, verse 25, and it says, they were in the garden, they were naked, and they felt no shame. Now, why am I pulling us back to that verse? What I can tell you is I promise it's not because I just want to say the word naked over and over and over, because we are going to say it a couple more times, but I promise that's not the intent here. The intent is being naked has a certain connotation to it, right? It is the most physically intimate thing, well, the second most physically intimate thing we can do with another human being, because we're completely exposed. There's nothing hiding. And so it's a very intimate, very difficult sometimes situation to be in. And Adam and Eve were constantly in that state, and they had no problem with it, because they had nothing to hide at this point, right? So then we come to chapter 3, verse 7. And it goes on to say that they knew they were naked now. So they sewed fig leaves together and made themselves an apron. So as Satan promised, Adam and Eve, they did now know the difference between good and evil. Their eyes were opened, right? Like we talked about, they realized something had happened that was different than before, and they were wrong. They realized that. That's a hard thing to realize, right? We talk about the age of maturity, right? The age of understanding. In criminal law, you have a standard, right? So in civil law is a mess. We're not going to get into that too much. Basically, you just have to be proven guilty, right? Like, yeah, we think you did that. And then there's usually a financial, reputational penalty that comes along with that. In criminal law, it's very different. In criminal law, you have to be proven guilty by not only what you did, but your state of mind. So I did something. I went over and I committed this criminal act. I took something that wasn't mine. Okay, so I'm guilty, right? Not necessarily. If I didn't have the right state of mind, I'm not guilty. There has to be an appreciation for what you do in order to impose guilt. Does that make sense? So think of children. Riley, our little 6-year-old that walks up and had the ugliest doll that I think she's ever had. And that's what she brings up this morning and gives money to the Bowls Home with and then waves it as she's coming back. That thing's so ugly. But anyway, she, all the time, I'll say, hey, Riley, you need to do this. And she turns and looks at me. She says, no. That's a big no-no in our house. Kids don't tell parents no. Riley is wrong. Does Riley understand the depth of what she's saying to me? No, she does not. Do I still beat her? Of course I do. But no, I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding. But no, every now and then, right? But she doesn't understand. So can I impose any kind of guilt on her for that? No, because she has no idea what she's really rebelling against. She doesn't even know that she's rebelling. So no, there's nothing there. Now, my 13, well, they're not 13 anymore, goodness gracious. One of them's 15 and one of them's 16. They're going to be getting their license, both of them, I think, this coming week. So pray for, don't pray for me. Pray for everybody else they're driving with, which won't be me. But so them, if I say, hey, Caleb or Jaden, you need to do ABC, whatever it is, and they look at me and they say, no. This is a much different conversation than it is with Riley, right, who is 6. Much different conversation because they appreciate their answer back to me. They understand the consequences. They know what they're doing. They know they're rebelling. Much different conversation. Welcome to Adam and Eve's reality after they eat the fruit, right? Their eyes were open. They know that they've rebelled against God. They know it. All right. Now, what's interesting here, and I think this is interesting whether or not you guys will, or I don't know. But when it talks about Satan going up to Adam and Eve or talking to Eve specifically, and he says, God just doesn't want you to have the knowledge he has, right? Like you will know the difference between good and evil. The word know there is the same word know that is used in Genesis 4:1, where Adam knew Eve and they conceived Seth. So it's an intimate understanding, not just a, hey, I get it. If someone were to say, hey, Dave, do you understand astrophysics? I mean, I understand what that is. Do I understand No. 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 That's just the simple answer. Do I know what it is? Yes. Do I understand it? No. So what we get here is not just a simple understanding of evil. It is an in-depth knowledge of the processes of evil. Okay? So that's what we get. That's what was gained. All right. So, this PowerPoint's killing me. I'm sorry. So verse 7, we get still in the effects of disobedience. So what did we really gain? I just outlined it, right? We walked with God we walked every day with God in the garden. His presence was there. So when Satan says, you will get a knowledge of good and evil, as we walked with God, did we need a knowledge of good? No. So what did we get? We got an intimate knowledge of evil. That was the benefit. So while Satan sold us an upgrade, we actually got quite the downgrade, huh? Yeah. So this is part of the incomplete deception that I was talking about earlier. He just left out some of the details, and we didn't understand them. Okay. Another benefit was humanity became the seed of Satan. This is really easy to describe. We see in verse 3:15, or chapter 3, verse 15 here, God says, I'll put enmity between you and the woman, between your seed and her seed. He's talking to Satan. Now, this is after everything has happened, right? This is God imposing punishment on Satan. So he says there's going to be a battle now. You're going to hate each other for the rest of eternity. I'm going to put enmity between you, your seed, Satan, and her seed. And the implication there is Satan now has a seed. And the word seed here is children. So when we chose to move away from God and do what Satan wanted us to do, we became seed of Satan. Does that make sense? Are we following here? Yes? No? I'm going to assume by everybody just blankly staring back at me, that is a yes. So what is going on here? This is a custody battle. Remember a couple weeks ago we talked about heaven almost operating in the fashion of a courtroom. That's not exactly how it works, but there are the character of God, his internal innate character, sets rules in place. And it is very court-like, right? These have to be adjudicated in a certain manner. And so here we see a custody battle. We see one person fighting against another person for custody of something in the middle. For ownership of what's in the middle. We happen to be in the middle. We get to choose, and we chose Satan. Are we good there? Does everybody understand that? Okay. Now, our choice is the reason that Jesus had to come and pay a ransom. Because the character of God, we'll talk about this a lot more next week, but the character of God requires. Satan doesn't have these restrictions, right? He just comes and steals us. God's not going to steal us back. He's going to do it the right way. He's going to get us back the right way. Therefore, a ransom had to be paid. Our debt had to be settled. Now, because of Jesus' ransom, the fact that we are Satan's seed is not a permanent condition. Right? We can choose better. We can choose different and move away from that and go back to God, right? Because he tells the woman, your seed, Satan's seed. So obviously there's things on both sides of the aisle here. Right? It's not a one or the other. We get to choose. So thank God, right, that we have that choice. And there's our header as the last thing that comes up on the slide, as every one of these slides. All right. So now the final benefit here, we're going to call it benefit, quote unquote, because remember, we're being sold an upgrade, is shame. And shame is really interesting, and I'm glad you said that earlier. Shame is really, really interesting because up until this point, shame was not a thing, at least not in humanity. Shame was not a thing. Adam and Eve walked every day in the garden with God. They didn't have any issue with shame. So what is shame? And we'll talk a little bit about guilt and being ashamed because I think they're all intertwined together. We use them interchangeably. And I'm going to give you some definitions here that are my best understanding of what I think the Bible is talking about when it says each one of those. You guys need to probably read this and try and figure it out for yourselves here. So guilt. What is guilt? Now we'll start there. MWD, Merriam-Webster Dictionary. So guilt, feelings of deserving blame, especially for imagined offenses, or from a sense of inadequacy, or the feeling of deserving blame for offenses. So guilt means I think I deserve something bad. Okay, that's guilt. What is guilt practically? And this is the Dave interpretation where I take several inputs and mold them into one that's probably not as good as any of the others that I originally had. But anyway, so guilt practically is my or another's determination of whether or not I've committed an offense. Right? And these can be valid or invalid. I can think I've done something wrong to somebody when really I haven't. Somebody else can think that I've done something wrong to them when I really haven't. Or vice versa. So valid or invalid. Okay? Being ashamed. So the feeling of guilt, shame, or disgrace is how Merriam-Webster defines it. I believe when you look in the Bible, this is kind of the trigger. Right? I think guilt is a yes or no. Guilty or not. It is not a feeling that persists. Guilt is just a matter of yes or no. Being ashamed is the feeling that comes along with the yes part of guilt, right? It is the trigger that says, oh, wait a minute, something is different, something is wrong. I need to fix something. That's what being ashamed is. And shame, Merriam-Webster. So it's a painful emotion caused by consciousness of guilt, shortcoming, or impropriety. Greg had me add, or my flaws, in terms of impropriety. Impropriety is a great word, by the way. If you ever get a chance to use it, highly recommend it. It's just a fun word to use, and it means a lot more than we realize, but we're not talking about it today, so we're going to go on to shame practically. But just in this situation, just think of it as your flaws, the things that I just know I can't do, or the character things that are just wrong with me to begin with. And it's okay, we all have them. Shame practically, this is my definition here. So the long-term feeling of being inadequate that leads to belief that God does not want me due to my perceived shortcomings. And the word perceived in that sentence, incredibly important. Because again, valid or invalid. There are many times where I perceive myself to be different than I actually am. There are many times where you perceive yourself to be different than you actually are. Should shame accompany you? No. Does it? Yes. So, perceived shortcomings, which also I think should give you a clue as to how you defeat shame. Oh man, this was supposed to be such a nice, okay, we'll go to her. So this is kind of the interaction of all three of these things: guilt, being ashamed, and feeling shame. So you start out where you think you deserve blame for something, right? That's the guilt, right? Yes or no, you deserve blame. Then you go down, and this guilt, then if it's yes, right, it causes me to think something is wrong. And that's where we get to the ashamed portion of it. From there, being ashamed adds stress to me. Now I know something's wrong because internally I'm feeling different than I usually do. I'm not myself in a negative way. From there, I have two options. Either on the left, the stress can be relieved properly, and when that's done, guilt is removed, or shame is removed. I don't have to worry about continuing in this state of something being wrong. Or, on the right side, stress is not relieved properly, and then shame sets in. And when shame sets in, unfortunately, you can see the loop back up to the top, although now there's no guilt, because guilt has already been established in your mind. The answer to that question is yes, for sure now. And so now, it's not about am I guilty? No, now it's about how inadequate am I? Does that make sense? Does everybody identify with that? Yeah, okay. Any questions? Oh, go ahead, Greg.
Just a comment that guilt can be relieved pretty easily.
Mm-hmm.
Shame can nearly always be relieved just through changing one thing or having a conversation.
Yep.
But guilt goes all the way to the core.
Yeah.
And when people act from guilt, from shame, it's as if their flaw is so deep within them, there's no hope.
Yeah.
People who feel that kind of toxic shame don't want the rest of the world to know just how bad they really are, and yet everybody in the room is just as bad if they're following the shame.
Yeah. Yeah, everybody hear Greg? Because that was a really good point. Shame, it goes to the core. And that's why I asked the question, how inadequate am I? Because now it's not a matter anymore of am I inadequate? It's a matter of how much. Okay, that's where shame really gets us. Okay, I'm hoping that eventually one of these slides will lay out itself the correct way. It doesn't. So anyway, let's go back now to verses 1 through 5. We talked about Satan, right, getting Eve to understand, or at least convincing Eve that, hey, God isn't who he says he is. You're not who you say, or you're not who he says you are. You need an upgrade. So eat this fruit real quick and you'll get that. Right? What is Satan actually attacking here? I mean, those are the questions, and we know the answers because she did eat the fruit. But what is he actually attacking? God? Sort of. Mm-hmm. His trustworthiness, yeah.
Self-perception, self-worth.
Yeah, we're going down that road here.
God's love for them.
God's love, yeah.
And it's also his plan for for they can be fruitful and multiply
Yep.
and, create that plan here on earth.
Yep.
And he gave, that full, at first, when Adam was there, you can name everything. He's giving the gift of this to him. And he had a plan for them.
Yep.
His purpose for them.
Yep. So, go ahead, Paul. I'm sorry.
He's taking the ownership of us.
Yeah. That's really close to where I'm headed here. Because I think you're all right, by the way. I think there's one word that accurately describes all of those things. Identity. He's attacking Eve's identity, her core of who she is. Why?
The identity that God gave us with shame. We belong to Him.
Yep. If you lose your identity in Christ, guess what word sums up the identity that you gain? Shame. So now at your core, now it's no longer God says I am this. Now it's, am I good enough for whatever? He attacks her identity. Because if she doubts who she is in God, what does she spend the rest of her life worrying about? We do it every day. For those of us that are concerned about a relationship with God anyway. We do it every day. What is she worried about? Salvation. Did God save me? And so the answer is never about, can I grow? The answer is always, or the question is never about, can I grow? The question is always, am I okay? And that's an incredibly powerful attack. Incredibly powerful. Because you see, we all think that Satan has this grand plan of getting us all to disown God. He doesn't. I'm convinced of that. He doesn't. If we do, great. But really all we need to do is not disown God. We just need to question whether or not we're okay with God. Because when I question whether I'm okay with God, guess what I'm not doing? Teaching anybody else about who God is. And so Satan doesn't have to get me to disavow God. He just has to make sure I don't teach anybody else about God. And then guess what happens? The church shrinks. We've seen evidence of that. Go ahead, Mike.
I don't think this disagrees. This is where I'm stuck right now. Because when you were asking that question, the way you laid out everything, I felt like what he was attacking was truth.
Mm-hmm.
Either God means what he says or he doesn't. So to me, that's kind of the overarching aim. Either we believe what he says, we obey what he says, or we go our own way.
Yeah.
Am I missing something?
Do we want to fight now or later?
Right now.
No, I'm just kidding. I think you're right. When I say the word identity, right, that's all encompassing. And truth would certainly be a large part of that. Because if God is not being truthful, if we don't understand the truth of God, what do we have? And so that's where I would go back and just say identity is a little bit broader.
I see what you're saying, Mike, and I'm with you on that. Overall, yes, Satan was attacking truth, but specifically with Eve, he was attacking her identity, who she was in God. That's how he got her to break and do what she knew she wasn't supposed to. Overall, yes, truth. Now she questions, is she really who God says she is? Therefore, truth now no longer stands.
So we'll talk about it tomorrow. We'll wrestle a little bit. I'll bring you around. Well, I won't because you're twice my size. So, yeah, it's Sweetwater's at 6:30. I'm always late to that too. I'm sure you're shocked by that. But Justin, go ahead.
I would add that he's attacking trust and relationship. And you're saying a lot of the same things. They're trusting each other because they immediately turn on each other and it starts like, well, this was because of the woman you gave me. And it was like, well, no, the serpent is the one that deceived me. And it breaks down the trust that they had in each other and the trust they had in God. And you immediately see them lose their innocence and try to clothe themselves. And there's a lot of like visual things that we see. They were innocent and naked before, and whether they were actually naked or not, or that's a portrayal of how close they were, and they had nothing to hide from each other is open for interpretation.
Yeah.
But they immediately clothed themselves, and now they're hiding from each other, and they're like, now the fight is between all three of them.
Yeah. Well, and it's interesting too. And look, I, again, don't disagree with anything that's being said. I just think identity encompasses all of those things. And I just lost my train of thought, so I'm sorry. I had something really great to come back to. I don't know. Maybe it wasn't so great. Maybe that was God letting me know that. All right, so we'll move on now. So we'll talk about the significance of shame here that we get. So we question God's character. And if you've seen the thing up top, these are all going to come from Genesis 3:10. We question God's character now because of our shame. How do we know that? Because Adam and Eve hid. Right? Every day God comes and walks with them in the garden. Except today, they thought something was different, so they hid. Because they weren't sure how God was going to react. They didn't know if God really was who he said he was. So they did something different. Now, we withdraw from each other. We isolate from ourselves, we isolate ourselves from each other and from God. Why do I say that? Because they made coverings for themselves, and then they hid. Why did they make coverings for themselves? What's that?
So I said, yeah, there's a good question.
Yeah. Oh, I thought it was a really great answer. I'm sorry.
Because you think, it says their eyes were open and they felt shame.
Mm-hmm.
You'd think the initial reaction would be they were ashamed because they had disobeyed God.
Mm-hmm.
But they were ashamed because they were exposed.
Yeah.
Does Genesis deal with that, you think, as to why that shame encountered or covered them being naked with each other?
I mean, we'll talk a little bit more about that here in a second. Yeah. So, why did they create coverings? Why did they isolate? Because, like you said, they were exposed. They thought they now had something to hide. Now, I have blame. I've done something I know I shouldn't have done, and I don't want anybody else to see it. So I'm going to hide that. And I think it's a little more figuratively here than metaphorically. But all right. Now, this is also a really, really important part of this. Really, really important. For those of you that know me well, I am a science, whatever, fill in the blank. You could say nerd, geek, whatever. I tend to think of it as enthusiast, maybe is a good word. I'm a science enthusiast. And what we find out here, oh, go ahead. Sorry, Shane.
It's unique in this that the nature of humankind, that we have the ability to be reborn in Christ. This is the first and only time that the reverse is true. So that feeling, emotions, understanding, or not understanding, the depth of that had to be something to deal with in that moment.
Yeah.
So the nature of hiding and becoming your own master at that point, because you've strayed, is that we decide to go our own route, right? Is significant.
Yeah. No, it really is. And that's another point that we're not going to talk about here, but it really is very pertinent to this. You know, up to this point, Adam and Eve had had innocent conversations and honest, open conversations with anything that they had conversations with. And I'm not going to pretend like I know, because I don't. And we can talk about that a little more next week too. But everything was so innocent up to this point, right? And sometimes we forget that. They've got a lot put on their plate right now, given it was their poor choice. But there's still a lot put on their plate that they have to deal with. So just something else to keep in mind. Back to my science tirade here that I'm about to go on. So what happens with shame too, and this is really, really important. Shame switches your brain, the fuel that your brain gets. It switches from joy to fear. Joy and fear run your brain for the most part, those two emotions. When joy runs your brain, you look at the world differently than when fear runs your brain. And we'll get into a little bit of that here in just a second. I'm not going to go too deep, don't worry, because I've only got 5 more minutes, and it would take me at least 6 more classes to explain this. So, fear is processed by your prefrontal cortex, your amygdala, and your hippocampus. Those are 3 parts of your brain. Your prefrontal cortex up here, your amygdala is here. I don't know where the hippocampus is. It's back here somewhere. That's how fear and joy both are processed in your brain. They cannot both be processed by these 3 regions at the same time. It's one or the other. That doesn't mean when you choose one that one continues into perpetuity. It does not. You can switch back and forth. You just can't have them both at the same time. Does that make sense? So the amygdala the amygdala, starts to control your thought patterns. Anybody else know what the amygdala controls? No? Fight or flight. When do we get into the point where we need fight or flight response? Survival. When I'm afraid of something. When I think that there's something negative around me that I have to respond to. Fight or flight comes up. Really, really different than when I look at everything around me in terms of opportunities, right? Really, really different. Your brain maps things. Turns out your brain is really, really smart. So it maps things, right? And what fuel that it has at that time, will determine how it maps things. So when your amygdala takes control and you're in flight or fight or flight response, and your brain starts mapping everything around you, it scans your entire environment. What is it looking for? There are a couple words all at once. I don't know. Threats. It's looking for threats. I'm looking at things I should be afraid of and aware of so that I can know how to respond to them. Do you think that happens when joy is in your brain? Also, the amygdala, it's kind of interesting, the spatial awareness of how these things fit in your brain. Your amygdala being in the back, and you think of regression, whereas your prefrontal cortex way up here, you think of moving forward. That's what is mapping things when you think through joy. And these are all, I really want to get into it, but we're not going to. Man, I really want to. Okay, anyway, sorry. I keep going back and forth because this is really fascinating to me. It's going to be super boring to probably most of you. I'm sure some of you will appreciate it, and like the two people that do will come up to me afterwards and we'll have this great conversation. But everybody else is going to be like, that guy's an idiot. So we'll move on from here. Anyways, your brain can default to joy or fear as it tries to think through things and progress and understand the stimuli around you. So with that, when we have shame at our core, fear takes over. All of our responses come from a place where now I think everything around me is a threat. And this makes sense, right? How do we know this makes sense? One, we experience every day. Two, when Adam and Eve experienced this, what did they do? They covered themselves and they hid because they thought there was a threat coming. Does it make sense? All right, we'll talk a little bit more about joy and how that affects the brain next week. But my attention here, when I'm powered by shame, when fear overtakes me, my attention now moves away from external factors as much. I'm not worried about how Mike is doing, which, just so you guys know, tomorrow night he's not going to be doing as well because we're going to fight. But I'm not worried as much about now how Mike is doing. I'm worried about how I feel. I'm worried about whether in this situation I am adequate. That's what I'm looking at. Every situation. I was afraid because I was naked, so I hid, Adam says. We're no longer concerned with those around us.
When somebody and then they internalize causing
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, so we'll talk about next week, right? Shame is a choice. You don't have to have it. You really don't. And understanding that, letting that be part of who you are to your very core will change who you are to your very core, I promise. But we'll talk about that more next week, and that's a good point. So Adam wasn't focused on his relationship with God. He was focused on how he felt in the situation. He was threatened in the situation, so he covered himself, he hid. Oh, I'm out of time. Yes. Yes.
Feel because of all the kind of stuff, the more you are in the Bible, that you would feel more shame because you see it based on what God doesn't want you to do. But if you're not embedded in God and His Scripture, shame just doesn't matter. You don't care because you didn't even know, because you're just like, whatever. I mean, I don't care. So it becomes normalized.
So let me start by well, I'm not going to go all the way, I was going to go back, but there's no quick way to do that. Remember the definitions of guilt, ashamed, and shame. I think what you're saying is, should we feel more shame because we know what's right and we know how wrong we are? Is that?
Yes, but we know, like, based on your math, very quickly, there's two ways that are there, and I look at it as, if I do it the right way on how to deal with shame the way God wants me to do it in Scripture, I won't go back to it.
Correct.
But if I go the other way, which is like, well, I'm going to do it my way, it's just going to keep going until you finally do it the way He wants you to do.
Correct.
And then it goes away.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. So hope everybody heard that. You can get rid of it. That's the highlight today. We'll pick up here next week. I'll remake these slides a little bit. I'll reanimate them so they're not so out of order, but we've only got a couple left to go. And that one that I thought was going to be really neat turned out to look a little more serial killer-ish. But that's okay. We'll go through that next week too. Then we'll go through our conclusions. We'll take questions. And then we'll move on to God and grace and how we deal with shame appropriately, things like that. So if you have any questions, let me know. Here, eventually, yep, there you go. There's my contact information. Feel free to email, text, call, whatever. I'm happy to fight with anybody just like I'm going to with Mike tomorrow.